In the year 208 AD, along the muddy banks of the mighty Yangtze River, the largest naval armada in Chinese history stretched across the water like a floating city of death. 800,000 soldiers, according to their commander's boast, crowded onto vessels that creaked under the weight of ambition and steel. At their head stood Cao Cao, the most feared warlord of his generation, a man who had crushed every rival in his path, and now gazed south with hungry eyes toward the last unconquered lands of China. But what awaited him on those dark waters would not be glory. It would be an inferno that would consume his dreams and change the course of Chinese history forever. The autumn of 208 found the Middle Kingdom bleeding from 1,000 wounds. For nearly 4 centuries, the Han dynasty had ruled over the vast expanse of China, but now the ancient order crumbled like a house built on sand. Emperor Xian, barely more than a puppet on his gilded throne, watched helplessly as warlords carved up his empire like vultures feasting on a carcass. The Yellow Turban Rebellion had shattered the dynasty's grip on power, leaving behind a fractured land where might made right and the strongest took what they pleased. From this chaos rose men of terrible ambition. Cao Cao was not born to rule, but he had seized power with both hands and refused to let go. By 200 AD, he had crushed his greatest rival, Yuan Shao, at the bloody fields of Guandu, unifying the northern plains under his iron fist. The victory had been total, devastating, and it announced to all of China that a new master had emerged from the ashes of the old world. But Cao Cao was not content with half an empire. The southern regions remained defiant, protected by the natural barrier of the Yangtze River and ruled by warlords who dared to dream they could stand against his might. Liu Bei, a descendant of the imperial line who claimed legitimacy through blood, and Sun Quan, master of the wealthy southern territories, had thus far escaped his grasp. That would change. In the winter of 207, Cao Cao secured his northern frontier by crushing the Wuhuan people at White Wolf Mountain, a campaign so swift and brutal that it left his enemies reeling. When he returned to his capital at Ye, he was appointed chancellor by his own recommendation, effectively placing the imperial government under his control. The boy emperor had become his prisoner in all but name, and with that final peace in place, Cao Cao turned his attention south. The plan was audacious beyond measure. Where previous campaigns had been fought with cavalry and infantry across the familiar plains of the north, this would be different. The Yangtze River was not merely an obstacle, it was a highway that could carry his armies deep into enemy territory. At the captured naval port of Jiangling, Cao Cao seized a fleet of river vessels and began one of the most remarkable military transformations in ancient warfare. His hardened soldiers, veterans of countless battles on dry land, would become Marines. The sight must have been extraordinary. Hundreds of thousands of men, accustomed to the thunder of hooves and the clash of steel on solid ground, now found themselves crowded onto wooden decks that rolled and pitched with every wave. These were not sailors but conquerors, and they carried with them the weight of Cao Cao's unshakable belief in his own destiny. He had never known defeat when it truly mattered, and he saw no reason why the southern waters should be any different from the northern plains. Yet beneath the surface of this massive undertaking, cracks were already beginning to show. The northern soldiers, raised in the dry climate of the central plains, found themselves struggling with seasickness that left them retching over the sides of their vessels. Tropical diseases, carried by the humid southern air, began to spread through the cramped quarters of the fleet. What had seemed like a masterstroke was revealing itself to be fraught with dangers that no amount of military genius could entirely overcome. Meanwhile, in the south, desperate preparations were underway. Liu Bei had been caught off guard by the speed of Cao Cao's advance, his forces scattered and his territories overrun in the opening moves of the campaign. Only the brilliant maneuvering of his chief strategist, Zhou, had prevented complete disaster, allowing Liu Bei to escape with his core followers and a long column of refugees who refused to abandon their lord. It was Zhou who proposed the unthinkable. Liu Bei and Sun Quan had been rivals, sometimes enemies, their ambitions often clashing along their shared borders. But now, faced with the overwhelming might of Cao Cao's war machine, old grudges had to be set aside. Neither could stand alone against what was coming down the river. Together, they might have a chance. The meeting between the two factions was tense, filled with the kind of careful diplomacy that desperate men practice when survival hangs in the balance. Quan commanded the loyalty of experienced river fighters, men who had grown up on the waters of the Yangtze and knew every current and sandbar. His fleet was smaller than Cao Cao's, but his captains understood naval warfare in ways that northern cavalry officers never could. Liu Bei brought legitimacy and the fierce loyalty of followers who believed in his claim to restore the Han dynasty. His forces were battered but unbroken, and they carried with them the righteous anger of men who had watched their homes burn. When the two leaders finally clasped hands in alliance, it was not friendship that bound them, but the cold calculation that only together could they hope to survive what was coming. The combined southern force numbered perhaps 50,000 men, a fraction of Cao Cao's vast host. On paper, it looked like a massacre waiting to happen. The northern warlord commanded not just superior numbers, but also the resources of the richest territories in China. His soldiers were veterans of countless campaigns, hardened by years of warfare and victory. His reputation alone was enough to make lesser men flee without fighting. But numbers tell only part of any story, and the Yangtze River was about to become the stage for a demonstration of why experience matters more than size, why understanding your battlefield can overcome raw strength, and why sometimes the greatest weakness lies hidden within apparent strength. As Cao Cao's massive fleet moved slowly down the river, his ships chained together to provide stability for his seasick troops, he must have felt the intoxicating certainty of inevitable victory. The southern rebels would be crushed, their territories absorbed into his growing empire, and the dream of a unified China under his rule would finally be realized. He had no way of knowing that his enemies were already preparing a weapon that would turn his greatest strength into his most vulnerable weakness. The stage was set for one of the most dramatic reversals in military history. On one side, the largest naval force ever assembled in Chinese waters, commanded by a man who had never known true defeat. On the other, a desperate alliance of rivals united by necessity and armed with intimate knowledge of the river that was about to become their salvation. The autumn winds were beginning to shift, carrying with them the promise of fire and the seeds of an empire's destruction. The southern commanders gathered in secret councils along the riverbanks, their faces grim as scouts brought word of the approaching armada. Zhou, Quan's most trusted admiral, studied the reports with the calculating eye of a man who had spent his life reading the moods of wind and water. The numbers were staggering. Even if Cao Cao's boasts of 800,000 were exaggerated, the reality was terrifying enough. 200,000 soldiers, perhaps more, packed onto vessels that stretched from shore to shore like a moving forest of masts and banners. But Zhou was not a man easily intimidated. He had earned his reputation in the treacherous waters of the southern rivers, where a single mistake could send a ship to the bottom and a captain's career with it. As he listened to the intelligence flowing in from his network of spies and informants, a plan began to take shape in his mind. It was audacious, dangerous, and would require perfect timing. It was also their only hope. The first reports of Cao Cao's tactical decision brought a grim smile to Zhou's lips. The northern commander, recognizing that his landlubber troops were suffering terribly from seasickness, had ordered his fleet to be chained together. Ship to ship, the vessels were connected by massive iron chains and thick ropes, creating a stable platform that would allow his soldiers to fight as if they were on solid ground. It was an ingenious solution to a pressing problem, the kind of innovative thinking that had made Cao Cao the master of northern China. It was also, Zhou realized, a gift from the gods of war. Word spread quickly through the Southern Alliance. Huang, one of Quan's most experienced generals, volunteered for what everyone understood might be a suicide mission. The plan was deceptively simple in concept, but fiendishly difficult in execution. Huang would pen a letter to Cao Cao, claiming that he had grown disillusioned with Quan's leadership and wished to defect with his ships and men. Such defections were common in the chaos of the times, and Cao Cao, ever eager to add to his strength, would likely welcome the reinforcement. But the ships that Huang would bring across the water would carry no soldiers. Instead, their holds would be packed with bundles of dry kindling, barrels of oil, and anything else that would burn hot and fast. These vessels would become weapons, fire ships that could transform Cao Cao's chained fleet from an asset into a death trap. The preparation was meticulous. Working under cover of darkness, Huang Gai's men hollowed out the interiors of their vessels and filled them with combustible materials. Reeds from the riverbank, dried wood from demolished buildings, and precious stocks of lamp oil were carefully arranged to create the most devastating fire possible. The ships had to look normal from a distance, their masts flying authentic banners, their decks showing signs of normal activity. But beneath this facade lay an inferno waiting to be unleashed. Meanwhile, Zhou, Liu Bei's master strategist, was studying the weather patterns with the intensity of a scholar poring over ancient texts. Everything depended on the wind. For the fire ships to work, they needed a strong southeastern wind to carry them into Cao Cao's fleet and fan the flames once the attack began. For days, the winds had been wrong, blowing from the north or remaining frustratingly still, but Zhou had spent years studying the seasonal patterns of the Yangtze Valley, and he knew that the autumn monsoon would soon shift. As Cao Cao's fleet drew closer to the Allied position, the tension in the southern camps became almost unbearable. Soldiers sharpened their weapons and checked their armor, knowing that if the fire ship attack failed, they would face a conventional battle against impossible odds. Officers held quiet conversations about fallback positions and evacuation routes, planning for a defeat that seemed all but inevitable. The night before the attack, Huang Gai made his final preparations. His letter to Cao Cao had been delivered and accepted, the northern commander apparently convinced by the general's claims of disillusionment. The meeting had been arranged for the following evening, when Huang Gai would bring his ships across under cover of darkness. It was a perfect setup, provided the wind cooperated and their enemy's suspicions remained dormant. In Cao Cao's camp, confidence reigned supreme. The great warlord had received Huang Gai's message and, after consulting with his advisors, had decided to accept the defection. More ships and experienced river fighters would be welcome additions to his force, and the propaganda value of a high-ranking southern officer switching sides would be considerable. Orders went out to prepare a suitable welcome for the new allies, complete with banquets and ceremonies to mark their change of allegiance. The irony was perfect. Cao Cao's very success, his reputation for inevitability, and his ability to attract defectors was being used against him. His enemies understood him well enough to exploit his strengths as much as his weaknesses, turning his confidence into complacency and his generosity into vulnerability. As the sun set on what would prove to be the last peaceful night for Cao Cao's ambitions, both sides made their final preparations. In the south, fire ships were positioned, and skeleton crews received their desperate instructions. They would sail their vessels into the heart of the enemy fleet, light the fires when they were close enough to ensure success, and then leap into small boats that would hopefully carry them to safety. In the north, soldiers cleaned their weapons and dreamed of the easy victory that awaited them. Many wrote letters home, describing the wealth they would soon acquire and the glory that would be theirs. The chained ships rocked gently in the current, their stability a comfort to men who had spent too many nights fighting nausea and homesickness. The stage was set for an encounter that would echo through Chinese history for centuries. On one side lay the largest military force ever assembled on Chinese waters, commanded by a general who had never known strategic defeat. On the other waited a desperate alliance armed with nothing but cunning, local knowledge, and a plan so dangerous that even its architects could not be to shift, certain it would work. The wind was beginning. Dawn broke over the Yangtze with deceptive calm, the morning mist rising from the water like the breath of sleeping dragons. But beneath this tranquil surface, the currents of history were already shifting. Huang Gai stood on the deck of his lead vessel, watching the wind vanes flutter in the strengthening breeze. The southeastern wind had finally come, just as Zhou had predicted it would. The gods of war, it seemed, had chosen their side. Across the water, Cao Cao's massive fleet lay at anchor like a city built upon the waves. The chained vessels stretched for miles, their masts creating a forest of wood and rope that blocked out portions of the sky. Banners fluttered in the growing wind, displaying the symbols of a dozen conquered territories and the personal emblems of generals who had never tasted defeat. It was a sight to inspire terror in any enemy, a demonstration of power so overwhelming that resistance seemed not just futile but insane. Yet Huang Gai felt no fear as he gazed upon this armada of doom. Instead, he saw opportunity written in every chain that bound ship to ship, in every gap between the vessels where fire might spread, in every banner that would soon become kindling for an inferno, unlike anything the world had ever witnessed. The very magnificence of Cao Cao's fleet was about to become its curse. The signal came just as the sun reached its zenith. From the southern shore, a single torch flared bright against the afternoon sky, held aloft by Zhou himself. It was time. Huang turned to his small crew, men who had volunteered for what they all understood might be a journey to the afterlife. Their faces were grim but resolute, bearing the expression of soldiers who had made their peace with death in service of something greater than themselves. The fireships began their final approach in loose formation, maintaining the appearance of a legitimate defection until the very last moment. Below decks, the carefully arranged combustibles waited in darkness, oil-soaked timber and bundles of reeds that would transform these vessels into floating pyres. The skeleton crews moved with practiced efficiency, each man knowing his role in the deadly choreography that was about to unfold. From his command vessel, Cao Cao watched the approaching ships with satisfaction. Intelligence reports had confirmed Huang growing dissatisfaction with Sun Quan's leadership, and the timing of his defection could not have been better. Fresh troops and experienced naval officers would be invaluable assets in the campaigns to come. The warlord was already planning the ceremonies that would welcome these new allies into his service, the banquets and rewards that would demonstrate his magnanimity to other potential defectors. His advisors stood nearby, some expressing quiet concerns about accepting enemy vessels so close to the main fleet. But their voices were drowned out by the chorus of flattery from courtiers eager to please their master. Cao Cao had surrounded himself with men who told him what he wanted to hear, and what he wanted to hear was that victory was inevitable, that his enemies were crumbling, and that the unification of China was merely a matter of time. The fireships drew closer, their crews maintaining perfect discipline as they navigated between the anchored vessels of Cao Cao's fleet. Northern soldiers lined the rails of the chained ships, curious to see these southern warriors who had supposedly abandoned their cause. Many called out greetings, welcoming the newcomers with the easy camaraderie of men who believed they served the winning side. Huang himself stood prominently on the deck of his lead vessel, playing his part to perfection. He returned the waves and shouts of the northern soldiers, even as his hand rested on the hilt of his sword and his eyes calculated distances and wind patterns. Everything depended on timing. Too early, and the fireships might be stopped before they could spread their deadly cargo. Too late, and the crews might not escape before the flames consumed everything in their path. The moment came without fanfare, marked only by Huang sharp whistle cutting through the afternoon air. Across the fireships, men moved with desperate speed, igniting oil-soaked torches and thrusting them deep into the prepared combustibles. The response was immediate and terrifying. Flames erupted from the holds of the vessels like demons bursting from the underworld, orange and red tongues of destruction that licked hungrily at the wooden decks and rigging above. The transformation was instantaneous. Ships that had moments before appeared as peaceful vessels of defection were suddenly revealed as instruments of annihilation. The carefully arranged kindling caught fire with explosive force, sending pillars of flame shooting skyward and turning the evening air into a furnace of superheated death. The southeastern wind, that gift from heaven that Zhou Liang had promised, seized the fires and drove them forward with the fury of a typhoon. Panic erupted across Cao Cao's fleet as the true nature of Huang mission became horrifyingly clear. Officers shouted contradictory orders, while soldiers ran in circles, unsure whether to fight the approaching flames or prepare to abandon ship. The chained vessels, moments before a symbol of stability and strength, now became a trap from which there could be no escape. As the fireships smashed into the northern fleet, their blazing hulks clinging to the chained vessels like burning leeches, the flames spread with a speed that defied belief. The sound was beyond description. The roar of the fire mixed with the screams of burning men, the crash of falling masts, and the thunder of exploding stores of oil and tar. Horses, brought aboard to serve the cavalry units, shrieked in terror as their stalls filled with smoke and flame. The great chain that had seemed so clever, so practical, now conducted the fire from ship to ship with mechanical efficiency, turning Cao Cao's entire fleet into a single massive pyre. Men leaped into the dark waters of the Yangtze, their clothing and hair ablaze, only to discover that the river itself had become a trap. Those who could not swim drowned quickly in the heavy armor they wore. Those who could swim found themselves caught in currents that swept them toward burning debris or into the path of other desperate soldiers thrashing in the water. The surface of the river became choked with bodies, some still moving, others already claimed by the flames or the depths. Cao Cao himself stood on the deck of his flagship, watching in stunned silence as decades of careful planning and preparation dissolved into chaos and ash. This was not how the story was supposed to end. He was the master of northern China, the man who had never known true defeat, the architect of a new dynasty that would reunify the Middle Kingdom under his rule. Yet here he stood, helpless, as his dreams burned around him and the night sky glowed with the light of his own destruction. The fire spread beyond the fleet itself, carried by wind and burning debris to the camps that had been established along the shore. Tents and supply wagons erupted in flames as sparks and ash rained down like deadly snow. Soldiers who had escaped the burning ships found themselves trapped between the blazing river and camps that had become infernos. The very magnitude of Cao Cao's force, which had seemed like such an advantage, now worked against him as masses of panicked men trampled each other in their desperation to escape the conflagration. Zhou had timed his follow-up assault perfectly. As the fire ships completed their work and the northern fleet dissolved into chaos, the southern forces struck from multiple directions. War drums thundered across the water as small, nimble vessels packed with fresh troops emerged from hidden anchorages along the shore. These were not the desperate survivors of a defeated army, but seasoned fighters who had spent their lives on these waters, moving through smoke and flame with the confidence of men fighting on familiar ground. The battle that followed was less a military engagement than a massacre. Cao Cao's surviving soldiers, demoralized and disorganized, could offer little resistance to the coordinated assault of their enemies. Those who had not been killed or wounded in the fire found themselves facing fresh troops while they were exhausted, smoke-blinded, and separated from their units. The southern forces showed no mercy, cutting down fleeing northerners and capturing those too wounded to resist. By midnight, the greatest naval fleet in Chinese history had ceased to exist. Where hundreds of vessels had once anchored in perfect formation, only burning wreckage remained, drifting slowly downstream like funeral pyres for an empire's ambitions. The Yangtze ran red with blood and black with ash, its waters choked with the debris of Cao Cao's shattered dreams. The great warlord himself barely escaped with his life, fleeing north with a handful of loyal followers as his surviving forces disintegrated around him. The man who had boasted of commanding 800,000 warriors now led perhaps a few thousand demoralized survivors, their faces bearing the haunted expressions of men who had witnessed the impossible. The unifier of China had become a refugee in his own empire, his reputation for invincibility shattered as thoroughly as his fleet. As dawn broke over the Yangtze, revealing the full scope of the catastrophe, messengers raced north and south with news that would reshape the political landscape of China. Cao Cao's defeat was not merely a military setback, but a fundamental shift in the balance of power that would echo through the centuries. The dream of reunification had died in the flames of Red Cliffs, and in its place rose the reality of a divided realm where three kingdoms would struggle for supremacy for generations to come. The fire ships had accomplished more than their creators had dared hope. They had not merely defeated an army, but had altered the course of Chinese civilization itself, ensuring that the ancient land would remain fractured and that the stories born from this division would captivate imaginations for 1,000 years and more. The flames that consumed Cao Cao's fleet at Red Cliffs did more than destroy ships and soldiers. They incinerated the last hope of reunifying China under a single ruler and gave birth to an era that would define Chinese culture for millennia. From the ashes of that terrible night rose the Three Kingdoms period, a time of legendary heroes and epic battles that would inspire countless stories, poems, and works of art. Cao Cao's dream of empire died on the Yangtze, but his defeat became something far more powerful than any victory could have been. It became legend. The fire ships of Huang, the strategic brilliance of Zhuge Liang, and the desperate courage of Zhou would echo through Chinese history, proving that sometimes the greatest victories come not from overwhelming strength, but from understanding your enemy's weaknesses and having the audacity to exploit them. The Battle of Red Cliffs reminds us that in war, as in life, the mightiest forces can be undone by the smallest flames, and that sometimes it takes an inferno to forge a legend that will burn bright in human memory forever. The Yangtze still flows today, carrying with it the echoes of that ancient fire and the stories of the men who dared to challenge the impossible.